Welcome to ODI Bites, a video series analyzing the policy and politics surrounding critical global challenges, featuring dialogue and debate with insightful commentators and expert observers. I'm your host today, Nilima Golrajani. I'm a senior research fellow at ODI with a special interest in the geopolitics of global development finance. This includes finance provided to sustain multilateralism and global cooperation. Today, we are exploring the politics behind a historic decision in May to triple the budget of a single multilateral institution, the World Health Organization. This will see a sizable growth in the obligatory fees that each WHO member state pays between now and 2028. Members willingly signed on to this permanent increase in their assessed dues to the WHO. In this conversation, we discussed how a confluence of factors aligned to catalyze such mammoth growth in the WHO's regular budget. We also looked at whether it was possible to replicate this pledge to grow predictable sources of finance beyond the WHO, including to other cash-starved UN entities. Joining me in this conversation was Bjorn Kummel, a senior political advisor on global health affairs in the German Federal Ministry of Health and the vice chair of the WHO Executive Board, and Silke Weinlich, a senior researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. Let's now turn to that discussion. A very warm welcome to you both. So Bjorn, I'm going to start off this conversation with you, given your role as chair of the WHO Working Group on Sustainable Finance. Can you give me a sense of what was agreed in May at the WHA, the World Health Assembly?
Okay, yes, of course I can. So practically in May this year, the working group presented its recommendations to the World Health Assembly and actually asked the World Health Assembly to approve those recommendations. So what did our recommendations ask the World Health Assembly to do? As you laid out, WHO is still facing a historic challenge of financing. It's a financing challenge that hasn't been adequately tackled within, I would say, the last 2 to 3 decades. WHO is heavily dependent on voluntary, to a large extent, earmarked funding coming from generous donors. Currently, only 16% come through the membership fee, through the assessed contributions. And the World Health Assembly approved that we will strive towards the goal to achieve practically a financing of WHO's budget through 50% long-term predictable resources, namely the assessed contributions.
Great, thanks. We'll dig into some of the detail of what you've said in terms of the reforms in subsequent question, but I guess I'm curious to know how this working group drove the decision forward and got it adopted by the WHO, given the politics and the difficulties of achieving such a historic increase in assessed contributions.
Yes, so I think the starting point first of all, we need to confess that this was not done in a week's time or overnight. Yeah, so this took more than a year. So the working group worked for roughly 1.5 years, met various times, and I think one of the and obviously we were supported by the political environment to a large extent. So practically, a starting point for the entire debate was the COVID lessons learned process. Practically all independent panels, high-level panels, recommend lots of things, but one thing they all recommended was that we would need to address the historical financing challenge of WHO. And without that, we wouldn't get a WHO that would be able to do its best in the next crisis to come. It's very clear that we will face new pandemics, in the future, hopefully not within the next 10 years, but next challenges will come, and we need to equip the WHO better for what's to be expected next. There was also this overall notion that there is a huge discrepancy in between what the world expects from WHO on the one hand, and on the other hand, how we are resourcing and equipping the WHO. So practically, while we expect lots of things from WHO to happen, we are not providing WHO with the right resources. nor financially, nor technically, but even politically to a large extent. And there was an overall understanding that the status quo is just not acceptable anymore, and that we would have to align expectations with abilities. And there are two ways of doing that. You can reduce expectations, or you can increase, obviously, abilities and resources. All non-state actors in favor of this huge increase. I think that's also something to be noticed. While I think there was controversy within 194 member states whether this is needed and whether this is doable for member states, everybody else, apart from member states, was sharing a complete consensus that this is needed and that member states would need to increase their assessed contributions. And we were using this, we were exchanging, we were getting in these calls from independent experts, non-state actors, but also media was playing a key role here.
Thanks. So clearly a confluence of factors, and I'll come back to this because as we think about reform more widely across other UN bodies, the question is whether there is any replicability or lessons to be learned from that experience. But I'd like to turn to Silke right now. Silke, of the 31 UN organizations receiving assessed contributions, more than half received the lion's share of their funding from voluntary sources. And historically, assessed contributions were only ever intended to be a modest obligation on member states. So I was wanting to know whether you think the increase in the WHO's regular budget can be repeated for other UN entities or not.
Well, Nilima, thank you for having me here. The straight answer, I think at the moment I'd be very surprised if any other UN organization was to repeat an increase at this scale in the near future. Well, increasing the regular budget is not popular, as Björn can tell, and there are a number of reasons as to why this is the case. On the one hand, the largest contributors to the regular budget in many organizations have been insisting on a zero nominal growth, and they are wary of increasing or of spending more funding on the UN or on UN entities. And in the current economic situation, you also have other countries who are wary of sort of spending funding on multilateral organizations. In the end, however, I think we're not talking about so much money when we talk about regular budgets, right? If we compare this to, I don't know, the G7 initiative on tackling global food security. And this leads to a second reason as to why the resistance is against increasing regular budgets is this high. Such funds are allocated on the basis of multilateral decision-making among 193 member states, depending on organizations, sometimes even also less member states. And all members have a say on its usage and on how the funds are distributed and allocated. And that means that there are often, of course, fierce battles over priorities. And it also means that for large contributors, there's less of an influence they can exert on how their funding is used. And there's a much more easy way to sort of ensure that funding is spent or allocated on topics, countries or situations as the contributor wished, and that is earmarked funding, as Björn has highlighted, and that gives contributors somewhat of an easy way around sort of these multilateral decision making. Which reduces their influence. And last but not least, I think there's another reason as to why it is so difficult, and that is there's also some form of mistrust vis-a-vis the international bureaucracy, because no actor, neither north nor south or west or east or whatever kind of blocks you want to sort of point out at the UN in decision making, none of the blocks, of course, is uniform, or all of them are heterogeneous, but all actors seem to have the feeling that they cannot really control the international bureaucracy, which is good because, as Björn also highlighted, it's about integrity and independence. But increasing regular budgets also means giving a greater leeway, a greater influence to the international bureaucracies, and that's why it is so difficult. And I don't, as I said in the beginning, I think it's unfortunate, but I don't expect any other international organization to follow suit as we have seen at the World Health Organization.
A related question somewhat is in the context of the increase in assessed contributions, there have been some concerns that might give disproportionate or not disproportionate influence to actors like China. So China now contributes about 12% of the overall UN regular budget. And some estimates suggest, given China's growth trajectory, that share will be equivalent to the US's share of 22% by 2028. So, will this increase simply give larger actors like China more influence over WHO? How do you characterize this debate?
I mean, that's a tricky debate, and I think there are as many different opinions as there are participants in that debate. Yeah, so it's obviously highly depending on from which geopolitical bloc you are coming from. There will be different views here. The WHO is a multilateral organization that is supposed to be independent from any of its donors. Currently, I think the main challenge is that voluntary donors provide most of the resource. I think in an ideal world, the entire budget would be financed through assessed contributions, which would give, obviously, the World Health Assembly, meaning all 194 member states together, really the ability to steer. Obviously, obviously that is not the case yet. The WHO governance, as all other UN agencies, I guess, foresee one country, one vote. So it's less dependent on how much you contribute as an AC, assessed contributions donor. But in practical terms, obviously, there are more influential players than others. It is a highly controversial debate, who is the most influential one. I guess if you're looking at who contributes the most, you're pointing your finger to the ones who are, for the past, have been highly influential. China has not been a huge donor to the WHO so far. As you are right, China's share will increase, as well as the share of many other emerging economies. And to be frankly speaking, I think in the entire debate to increase the assessed contributions, it was less the OECD, it was less the industrialized world, not Western Europe arguing against, and it was obviously not the developing countries arguing against. The African countries and many of the Western Pacific countries were fully on board from the start. Which the most tricky debate we were facing was with the emerging economies, countries who are more or less in between. And I think it took a long time to persuade those and making clear that we need a strong multilateral organization such as the WHO. Over to you.
Thanks for that. Silke, I'm going to turn to you. Now, several UN entities have been on the brink of insolvency, and many rely heavily, as we've heard, on voluntary contributions to make ends meet and to fulfill their mandates. So notwithstanding sort of your sobering view about the replicability of increasing assessed contributions to other UN entities, theoretically, can expanding assessed contributions make all UN organizations better able to deliver on their mandates? Or potentially, do we need to assess this on a case-by-case basis?
I think that's an interesting question. And I think I would probably also take issue with what Björn said in a way, because you argued if in an ideal world, all of WHO's budget would come from assessed contributions. I think earmarked funding or voluntary funding has its place in the overall funding mix of international organizations or of multilateral organizations. It can push for innovation. It can also allow certain member states to sort of push certain agendas. And I think earmarked funding can also bring UN entities to work together if they come in form of multi-donor trust funds. So not all earmarked funding or voluntary funding is per se bad. What is bad at the moment, and I think that's also sort of relating to the question you asked, is the absolutely tilted funding mix we have across the UN system, where core funds or assessed contributions, core funds for those organizations that do not have assessed contributions, are absolutely dwarfed by earmarked and voluntary funding.
Thanks. To pick up on this point that there is potentially some benefit of more voluntary forms of finance, I think Björn referenced the independent panel for pandemic preparedness that had recommended a third of the WHO's regular budget coming via replenishment mechanism, which is a form of voluntary funding, albeit on a multi-year agreement. And the idea, I guess, is that this will introduce a form of predictability, but still be voluntary on a 3-year basis, for example. So is this a better way of allocating financial responsibility? Is it an improvement over voluntary contributions on an annual basis? How do you characterize this?
All these different forms of funding have their place in a funding mix. You need a solid base of core resources. You also can have earmarked funding or voluntary funding for funding, I don't know, humanitarian aid, or for funding sort of thematic issue areas, which are particularly dear to some contributors. And you also can have a replenishment model, which, as you said, leads to a greater predictability, probably allowing an international organization to plan ahead in a better way. At the same time, I would always hold up the scale of assessment, the UN scale of assessment, which is used to calculate the contributions of each member state, as the one formula we have at the moment that every member state agrees on in how to contribute to basically global public goods, right? And we have a highly uneven world in terms of economic capabilities, in terms of other capabilities or needs. And having a scale of assessment, I mean, the UN institutional design, sort of giving each country one vote, mitigates this unevenness a bit, but of course not totally. It cannot do so totally. So having a scale of assessment which brings everyone in is a good idea. And replenishment models open up, I think, the UN also towards other actors contributing, which is very valuable. Having also private actors contributing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think overall, again, it's the funding mix and not so much one funding instrument providing a panacea.
Thanks, Silke, for that nuanced view. As we try and wrap this up now, just one final question to you both. We talk a lot about withering multilateralism and the failures of global cooperation on COVID response, and more recently on the crisis in Ukraine. And I guess just reflecting on the WHO decision to increase assessed contribution, do you kind of interpret that as representing renewed commitment to multilateralism and the possibilities for greater global solidarity, or do you see it differently? The result of just a confluence of factors, external pressure, and the particular moment of history we're living in with the pandemic. Bjorn, perhaps I'll have you start.
I think it's difficult to judge that. In my address to the World Health Assembly, right before we were adopting our recommendation, I practically said that to me it's a big signal of constructive multilateralism that we can present these consensual recommendations to the Assembly, and the Assembly, it was already clear that the Assembly would approve those. Absolutely true. So I think in the setting of the WHO, I think it's really a sign of there's a belief that we need this multilateral player, an inclusive organization, and that we need to do our share in order, as member states, in order to align expectations and abilities. So to me, yes, that's the signal. Whether we can, the big question of this discussion here is whether we can use the model of the WHO and more or less transfer this to any other UN agency. And I would say, I hope we could, but I doubt it's possible. It potentially will not be possible because this was a one-time opportunity given the circumstances of COVID-19 and the political pressure that we were able to build up in the process. That's the one factor. The second factor is that even if you compared WHO to many of the other UN agencies, you will see that with some other exceptions, practically WHO, there's a specific case, and we were trying to make that. There's a specific case for WHO, this heavy reliance as a technical agency, which is heavily dependent on, human capacity, expertise. You have to build this up. So it's a knowledge-driven organization, and you just can't run this on this heavy dependency on voluntary, unpredictable resource. And we even discussed it. Is this now a precedent for the UN. And we argued, obviously, in the working group, no, it's not, because if we had said, yes, it was, then obviously that might have even deterred some member states to agree to it. So, but I think, obviously, there are lessons to be learned. I think the way we try to handle this in this multilateral constructive spirit, trying to really build the case, discussing all arguments, etc. I think you can build on this. Hopefully there is a certain trend, a renewal also for other UN agencies to again discuss, is this the right funding mix? This heavy dependency also for other UN agencies on earmarked, voluntary, unpredictable resources, or do we have to discuss this and find other financing abilities? And maybe a final a word also to this idea of a replenishment model. I think it will add, it's an interesting idea, and this is why we practically recommend it. However, we don't know whether it will finally work in a UN agency like the WHO, but we want to explore it. But it was also highly controversial, and it remains to some extent controversial. Over to you.
Silke, please, the final word here on that question.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the decision at the WHO or WHA, and also maybe it's in line with World Trade Organization's decisions on fishery and on the waivers on vaccine patents, right? It's a sign that multilateralism maybe is not as dead as some claim it to be. It's sort of, that's not as, I'm not sure if it can be interpreted as a new sign of a revival of multilateralism or global solidarity, but what it shows that it is still possible among 194 member states to come to decisions and come to solutions which might not be perfect, but which hopefully help the UN to provide more effective, or to have it work more effectively on transnational problems. So it's not easy to argue that multilateralism is thriving these days, right? And I don't think it's going to be any better anytime soon. But on the other hand, I think it is also not as threatened, or as some observers might say, right? That's maybe not the answer you wanted to have from me, but at least it is, multilateralism is alive, and in many areas, not only with regard to these decisions I just pointed out, but with regard to many other policy processes underway.
Thank you for tuning into this latest episode of ODI Bites. We hope our discussion on the politics of multilateral finance provided plenty of ideas for how we can restore and renew international institutions so they can better address the biggest global challenges of our times. Remember, you can catch up on all previous ODI Bites episodes and much more by visiting www.odi.org/events. Thanks.